For many centuries in the English-speaking world, hardcover was the format for books. Good quality paper and a sturdy exterior ensured that books would last. The need for a cheaper and more convenient format, however, was clear early on, and at the start of the 16th century, Venetian printer and publisher Aldus Manutius pioneered a new genre, the pocket edition. As technology and industry progresses, however, so follows the creation of books, and in the 19th and 20th centuries, a new phenomenon rocked the publishing world. Books that were already published in traditional hardback form were being republished as paperbacks. Nowadays, paperback publishing has become a worthy format in its own right, with many popular books first being introduced in paperback format. But publishers weren't too keen on them in the beginning. Hello, beautiful bookworms. I'm Squirrelly Nerdy Jess, and today we're going to examine the history of the humble paperback book. The production of books really began to change in the 1800s. The updated technology of the mid-Victorian era allowed for the mass production and consumption of many products, including new abilities to print books very quickly with new, cheaper types of paper. So, beginning in the mid-19th century, very cheap paperbacks, no better than newspapers or magazines in material quality, began to appear. In the USA, inexpensive paper-bound publications such as almanacs, tracts, and chapbooks had already been published since colonial times. But starting in 1860, around the same time as the start of the Civil War, the publisher Beadle and Company introduced a new popular form of fiction called dime novels, named as such as they cost only a dime, or 10 cents apiece. Beadle's dime novels were the start of a new sensation, sold in newsstands and dry goods stores. They were pocket-sized, sextodecimal books of approximately 100 pages each, numbered in a series, bound in orange covers with woodcut illustrations on the front. Competitors arose by the late 1870s, dropping the price by half by serializing stories across many issues. Instead of 100 pages, these nickel novels would be only 16 to 32 pages long, with a foreboding to be continued, keeping readers engaged to continue purchasing. Some publishers developed story papers, which looked like newspapers, but over time featured virtually no news or advertising, instead more serialized tales. To sell more books at such cheap prices, publishers targeted the uneducated lower class, so these stories were simple but sensational, with formulaic plots filled with romance, adventure, and nationalism. They often featured tales of cowboys and, as they were then called, American Indians, although there was also a little-remembered market for women, which focused on romance and marriage, often focusing on a relatable working-class girl. By the 1880s, the stories evolved into more city life, rags to riches stories, with tales often focused on a single hero or heroine, endorsing some sort of moral value. Despite this, many respectable parents forbade such, quote, pernicious trash for boys, condemning the violence within the plots and driving such youngsters to read them secretly. Yet these stories shaped the youthful reading experiences of so many, including author Upton Sinclair and writer and cartoonist James Thurber. A similar sensation arose in Britain with the penny dreadfuls, starting even earlier in the 1830s. Aimed at young working-class men, these very cheap booklets would serialize a story in weekly parts of 8 to 16 pages long, each one costing 1 penny. These tales were equally sensational, but instead focused on stories of detectives, criminals, or supernatural entities such as Sweeney Todd, Dick Turpin, Varney the Vampire, and Spring-Heeled Jack. That said, some of the American dime novels were actually edited and rewritten into penny dreadfuls for British audiences, and vice versa, as before the International Copyright Agreement of 1891, both sides of the pond were allowed to reprint any content at will. In both cases, these cheap paperbacks were a hit, their popularity owing to a simultaneous rise in literacy in both countries due to social and educational reform, as well as a rise in commuting by railroad. And with it, the concept of reading for leisure. In fact, as industrialization and capitalization continued to grow, the concepts of leisure and entertainment in themselves became emerging industries. The penny dreadfuls of Britain saw their first competition in the 1890s with Alfred Harmsworth, owner of the Daily Mail and Daily Mirror, whose amalgamated press introduced even cheaper halfpenny periodicals, bringing forth a new era of comics that dominated until the emergence of DC Comics in the 1930s. Hilariously, Winnie the Pooh author A.A. Milne described these as halfpenny dreadfullers. But equally, there were efforts to introduce a higher class of literature using this cheap production process. Around the same time, several prominent British publishers introduced Sixpenny Novels. These paperbacks were just slightly smaller than octavo size, a standard for most hardbacks, with text sometimes in 2 parallel columns, and were reprints of novels that had already been printed in hardcover format. But even these were of such poor quality that they were essentially designed to be disposable. A new calling began for sturdier paperbacks that, once read, could be put on a shelf to be enjoyed again, especially as reprints of better quality literature became more popular. By the early 20th century, such paperback reprints were generally confined to the English-speaking world, but in fact, the real start of paperback reprints happened in Germany over half a century earlier. In 1841, Christian Bernhard Tauchnitz began reprinting British and American authors for distribution throughout non-English-speaking countries in continental Europe. In fact, Tauchnitz paperbacks were specifically marketed as, quote, not to be imported into Great Britain. Similar to the dime novels and penny dreadfuls, Tauchnitz paperbacks could be found at railway bookstalls, hoping to catch British travelers embarking on long train rides. But they were also in the German bookshops, aimed at those wanting to learn English. To keep costs low, the covers were a very standard format, but slightly sturdier than what we've seen so far. Tauchnitz had one rival, Albatross, founded in Hamburg in 1932. Now, Albatross is a little-known publisher today, but I have fallen in love with these little books. They really set the groundwork for some of the paperback giants to come. Beginning with the Albatross Modern Continental Library, Albatross had beautifully simple but colorful standardized covers designed by Hans Marderstieg, and even included dust jackets. They were solid and lovely to hold, using a golden ratio size of 18 by 11 centimeters, which became the standard for paperbacks. Also targeting the English language market in continental Europe, the word albatross, with 1 or 2 S's, was specifically chosen as it's essentially the same in German, French, and Italian, allowing for seamless branding and marketing. This sort of proactive marketing, combined with their high-quality yet affordable design, worked well for them, publishing around 400 titles in their original library before segregating into different genres, each given its own color scheme, an idea briefly used by Tauchnitz but expanded on by Albatross. Following in the footsteps of publisher Collins recently developed The Crime Club in the UK, and even getting some assistance and cooperation with them, Albatross launched the Albatross Crime Club in 1933, using a black and red color scheme. For fans of Agatha Christie, it is worth noting that all of Albatross's pre-World War II Christie titles in their Crime Club, from Lord Edward Dies in 1933 to Appointment with Death in 1938, are the true first paperback editions, coming before the pocketbooks, Penguin, and even slightly before the Collins editions. Albatross also had a mystery club with a green and gray color scheme. Both the crime and mystery clubs printed approximately 100 titles before World War II, but unfortunately the publisher struggled to restart post-war, so it ultimately merged with Tauchnitz. However, in the UK and the US, paperbacks were starting to pick up, often copying the Albatross model. The legacy of the modern English paperback really began in Britain with one man, Alan Lane, the managing director of the publishing house The Bodley Head. As the story goes, Lane was inspired to want to create cheap but good-looking quality books for the masses, following an experience at Exeter railway station where he was disappointed at the poor choice of reading material on offer. He had also recently attended a conference in Oxford at which it was discussed how publishers could reach a wider audience. Lane, along with input from his brothers and fellow directors Richard and John, therefore suggested to the Bodley Head that they start printing paperbacks to sell for 6p each. But the other directors didn't understand this vision and couldn't fathom how they'd make a profit at such a low price. The sixpenny novels of other publishers didn't seem to last by this point. What were they to do? Well, Lane resigned from his position at the Bodley Head, and in 1935 founded Penguin Books. Sort of. The first Penguin books were actually published as an imprint of the Bodley Head, although using Lane's brother's own private capital. But they quickly proved their worth, and Penguin Books was established as a separate business in 1936. Part of Penguin's quick success was due to their cover design. Since the Lane brothers were insistent on keeping the price at sixpence, the equivalent of 10 cigarettes at the time, it meant that the profit margin would be so small that each title needed to sell a large number of copies, at least 17,000 copies, to break even. They realized the books needed to look attractive in order to engage not just traditional bookshops, but other outlets as well, to display them in order to achieve a large number of sales. Penguin books therefore all featured the same relatively standard design, somewhat derived from the Albatross series. Simple, but striking, with 3 horizontal stripes, the upper and lower color-coded for different genres or categories, orange, general fiction, biographies, dark blue, crime and detective fiction, green, travel and adventure, cerise, plays, red, world affairs, gray, essays and belles lettres, purple, light purple, kind of both, and miscellaneous, yellow. Early copies, like Albatross, included dust jackets. But paper shortages during World War II put an end to that practice. Over the subsequent decades, the logos and covers would become more refined, with different series having their own styles and often unique design elements, paralleling the emergence of graphic design as a profession in itself. In celebration of their 90 years of publishing history, Penguin Books released the Archive series in 2025, showcasing this change in design templates over the decades. For anyone interested in a deeper design history of Penguin Books covers, I recommend checking out Penguin by Design, a cover story by Phil Baines. Even with a strong design idea in place, with a dummy book made up to show prospective buyers, gathering orders was not easy. The Lane brothers traveled the UK and negotiated overseas contracts, but only managed to acquire half the sales needed to break even. That is, until Alan approached Woolworths, a major high street retailer in Britain, who purchased 63,500 copies for their stores, funding the first printings of the first Penguin books outright. The books sold immediately, and within 10 months, Penguin Books had printed over 1 million books. It wasn't even that long before Penguin was able to start publishing original writing. 1936 also saw the beginning of a new non-fiction imprint, Pelican, including the publishing of George Bernard Shaw's The Intelligent Woman's Guide to Socialism, Capitalism, and Sovietism, for which Shaw offered to write a new section explaining Bolshevism and fascism. It seemed that Penguin had perfected the balance of price, excellence of written material, and a convenient format, along with a strong design that meant a decade later the words penguin and paperback had become virtually synonymous. Meanwhile, in America, 6 years before Penguin, Charles Boney wanted to utilize the book club subscription model and began publishing a series of paper books in 1929. A customer of the Charles Boney Paper Books Club would buy a subscription of 12 titles for $5. The books arrived in a printed envelope and featured modernist designs by Rockwell Kent on the covers. Any of the paper books titles could then be returned to the publisher with $1 in exchange for a hardcover binding. Clearly, there was a fear that the paperback format would be too radical for readers of modern literature. Unfortunately, the series was not able to withstand the strain of the Great Depression and ceased publishing in 1930 after 16 issues. However, that same year, Boney began a new series of Bonibooks in both paperback and hardcover of reprints of more popular, older Boney titles, absorbing many of the paper books titles as well. Bonibooks was separate from the subscription book club, but even so, the paperback side of the enterprise didn't last long. By 1931, Boney gave up on paperbacks altogether. It wasn't until 1939, when entrepreneur Robert de Graaf partnered up with the publishing house Simon & Schuster to found Pocketbooks, that America would start to see the true potential of the paperback book, what became known as the mass market paperback. Following Penguin's successful model in Britain, Pocketbooks priced its books at 25 cents and featured the logo of Gertrude the Kangaroo. Pocketbooks revolutionized the industry by cutting down the size of the book so that it could fit in a pocket, and by gluing the books rather than stitching, both of which cut costs. Despite the success of Penguin and Pocketbooks, hardcover publishing remained quite distinct from paperback publishing for the most part. Back in England, Alan Lane had developed a business code with hardcover publishers where they would not be asked nor expected to release a title for paperback printing less than 12 months from the date of the original publication, unless both parties agreed upon it. However, no such code developed in the US, and as a result, paperback publishers became rivals. But all that was to change again when World War II struck.
When you hear these warning sirens, take cover at once.
The war had an enormous impact on book publishing across both sides of the pond. Air raids in the UK were destroying millions of books in the process. Between September 1940 and May 1941 alone, approximately 2 million books were destroyed. Paper had to be rationed as well, meaning the government wanted as many books as possible printed from a given tonnage of paper. A book production war economy agreement was put in place, mandating smaller type, less white space, and inferior paper in bindings to conserve the raw materials. Paperbacks became a prime candidate for book format. Penguin was especially lucky in finding that not only could a battle dress pocket accommodate their books to a near perfect fit, but given that paper rationing was based on consumption during the 12 months before hostilities began, they were given a far greater accolation than most other publishers. Meanwhile, the US began producing overseas editions, free for the armed forces. Landscape-formatted books printed in double column, designed to fit in soldiers' uniform pockets, providing them entertainment and literature during wartime. Believe it or not, F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, originally a flop when it was first published, owes a lot of its fame today from its production as an armed forces edition, which boosted its reputation. When the war ended in 1945, hardcover publishers were facing radical changes. Paper rationing continued in the UK through 1948, meaning hardcover publishers were unable to fulfill orders for the cheap editions and pocket series they'd previously produced. This vacuum was filled instead with paperbacks. So paperbacks were strongly on the rise, but the material being published during and immediately after the war was still predominantly reprints. The only exception was with Penguin Books, from which 3 out of every 5 titles were now original publications. Elsewhere, though, the field was dominated by stories of sex, crime, westerns, and science fiction, all in glossy so-called cheesecake covers to best appeal to customers. Because the thing was, for the first time, the public was making their own choices about what they wanted to read because of where books were being sold. Instead of booksellers deciding which hardcovers to buy in and sell to customers, the public were able to go to their local drugstore and pick out a title for themselves. And if they didn't like it, it was cheap and disposable. Paperbacks were becoming a chief consumer good of the middle class. It wasn't until 1949, when paperback publishers faced a shortage of hardcover titles for reprint, that they began commissioning original work en masse. Shortly after, in 1950, serious titles were introduced to the paperback market, a little less than half being non-fiction titles. This correlated with a rise of competition within the paperback industry throughout the 1950s. In 1947, Pan Book was founded by Alan Bott, previously the founder of the Book Society and the Reprint Society, with backing from Collins, Macmillan, and Hodder and Stoughton. Corgi also emerged in 1941 with a more targeted readership and a different approach to marketing their titles, and many other publishers began to follow the trend. The rest, as they say, is history. From there, the US became a prime mover in spreading paperbacks to the rest of the world, creating the United States Information Agency in the 1950s, which aimed to spread American books abroad. Cheap paperback reprints continued to thrive in this way, including to countries of limited means where education may be poor. Since the 1960s, more hardback publishers started their own paperback imprints, creating even more competition. Nowadays, the humble paperback is beloved amongst many readers and featured on many a shelf. No longer considered disposable, the paperback has really come into its own and even seen an uplift in material quality over the decades amongst some publishers. But here's some sad news. The cheaper mass market style of paperback is going extinct. sales have fallen dramatically over the last 10 years. Whether that's due to an overall decrease in reading, or the preference of ebooks or audiobooks to those who would normally buy these cheaper forms of books, or the fact that people still buying physical books prefer nicer copies. I mean, who knows? But this is leading the main distributors to announce they will no longer distribute them to the stores, airports, etc. that they used to. And if the books won't get distributed, it makes little sense for publishers to continue publishing them. That doesn't mean the paperback is going away, but the paperbacks remaining will be of the more expensive type. Now, there is a benefit to this shift. As a secondhand bookseller, I see firsthand how fragile the cheaper paperbacks can get over time. The glued binding degrades, causing the pages to fall out. The cheap paper browns and foxes and sometimes even dries out and flakes away. So it might actually be a positive from an environmental viewpoint that the books that are being produced will be able to last longer. But there are other factors to consider. Paperback publishing is also incredibly important for authors. A successful author might sell tens of thousands of hardbacks, but millions of paperbacks. And the cheaper, more affordable mass market paperbacks are a huge portion of those sales. The New York Times recently published an article which included an interview with Stephen King talking about not only how much mass market paperbacks influenced his career, but how they influenced him as a person growing up and reading everything he could get his hands on. It's worth checking out. While I do love to look at a beautifully bound hardback, I have to admit I find paperbacks a little cozier, a little more approachable when I want to sit down and read. And even though they aren't built to last, I have many a pocket and mass market paperback in my library. Each format certainly has its place, although I am sure there is plenty of debate between hardcover fans and paperback fans. In fact, what do you think? Which format do you prefer? Let me know in the comments. But in any case, thank you for joining me on this little jaunt through book history. A big thank you to my current, I don't know how many subscribers because I have to look it up. Oh, 9,208 subscribers, as well as all other fellow bookworms collectors and nerdy human beings watching, and anyone joining in from the future. Also, if you enjoy my content and wish to see more of it, you can support my channel by leaving me a one-off tip at coffee.com/squirrellynerdyjess, or leave me a super thanks here on YouTube. There's absolutely no pressure to do either of these things. I expect absolutely nothing, but it does help to allow me to carve out a bit of time to learn, create, and share more with you. Until next time, be kind, be curious, be authentic, and effective. Bye! Be quiet, rats. The Albatross climb crab? Albatross launched the Albatross climb. I did it again. Penguin Books. I'm starting to sound like Benedict Cumberbatch. Penguin. When paperback publishers faced a shortage of hardcore. I need all of the colors. Red, yellow, green, red, blue, 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 red, purple, green, yellow, orange, red. Red. I need all of the colors. Oh, sorry, camera.